All right. I'm going to address some of the allegations that AMD is blocking DLSS support. All of this started with this WCCF Tech clickbait article that was just asking what's with the missing DLSS support in AMD sponsored titles. Now, they put a list right here showing that in a lot of AMD sponsored games, there's no DLSS support. Now, here's the thing. They asked AMD about this, about why is there no DLS in some of these AMD sponsored games. And then AMD just said, well, there's some games with DLSS only, and there's some games with FSR only. They never said anything about blocking NVIDIA or anything. But then they asked NVIDIA about why is there no DLSS in many of these games. And NVIDIA is like, well, we don't block or restrict or do any of this other stuff, basically doing attack at AMD. So when you look at this, if this is all the information you'd have, you'd be like, oh, look, NVIDIA games have FSR, but AMD games don't. Now, here's when you get into a bit of an issue, is when you're looking at a lot of these games that have FSR and if they have DLSS like support, like let's look at this. So the very last game that supported only FSR, it's actually FSR 1.0 by the way, so it probably doesn't even have temporal anti-aliasing. If it does, I guess I just didn't want to bother upscaling. But this game was not an AMD sponsored game. This game before that only had FSR was not an AMD sponsored game. This other game right here was not an AMD sponsored game. This game right here was not an AMD sponsored game. So why are all these games that don't have it on here? Like the last game that they can point to that came out that was an AMD sponsored game, Jedi Survivor. Now, like if you go and look at the list right here, like we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games right here in a row that have FSR and are non-sponsored. And then we go down to the 6th game, which is an AMD sponsored game. So here's the real reason why a lot of these games do not have DLSS. So consoles do not support DLSS. Consoles do support FSR. Now, most games that have DLSS right now realize that, hey, with DLSS support, this doesn't work on 10 series NVIDIA GPUs, this doesn't work on AMD GPUs, and the most important thing is this doesn't work on consoles. This is the big reason. So if your game has DLSS, but you still want upscaling, and you're going to have it for consoles, you're going to have to add FSR in there as well. Now, FSR is also much easier to add, mainly because you're allowed to modify it. You can't really modify DLSS. You'd have to ask NVIDIA to fix something if there's some sort of bug. And there's also the licensing for DLSS, much different than FSR. You can literally tweak FSR as much as you want, and they have no issue with you doing that. But here's the thing. If AMD sponsored games were not having any FSR, how come even on this list, some of these games have DLSS support? So Forspoken had it at launch. Last of Us had it at launch. Uncharted had it at launch. So why are some of these games AMD sponsored? Because these people, these are a lot of the bigger developers. This is Sony for some of these games, like Last of Us and Uncharted. Those were Sony games. So they decided to put a lot of effort to make sure this would give people a great experience regardless of what card they have, and decided, we have enough development time, we're going to add, DLSS for NVIDIA users, because many NVIDIA users prefer DLSS. There are advantages and disadvantages to DLSS versus FSR, but most people prefer DLSS. Not all people, but most people do. DLSS typically is more temporally stable, but you do get slightly worse image quality and slightly more ghosting in most titles. Not always the case, but most cases. But because of the temporal instability, many people don't like FSR because, especially on like foliage, they'll notice like a little bit of shimmering. DLSS used to have this as a major issue, and they've not eliminated it, but they've reduced it to a high degree where FSR is a bit behind there. So most people prefer DLSS, opting to accept a slight amount of ghosting in exchange for a much more stable image with less shimmering and artifacts in that sense. But here's the thing, AMD sponsored games actually seem like they're more likely to support DLSS than non-NVIDIA sponsored games, or I mean a non-partnered game. What really is the case is most non-NVIDIA sponsored games do not have DLSS at all, with the exception of really high budget like first party games from Sony and some of these other extremely high budget AAA titles. Diablo is like one game where it's kind of interesting. Like this is a game that is from NVIDIA sponsorship, but it actually restricts your upscaling to only FSR if you're on an AMD card, which makes sense, kinda. It'd be weird that you can't set the Intel upscaling, but you probably wouldn't want to. But NVIDIA doesn't have the option to use FSR or XESS. Then Intel can only use XESS, which again, it's you would think that anybody could use FSR and XESS, and NVIDIA could use all three. But like that's just a weird thing. I doubt NVIDIA had anything to do with that. That's probably just a design choice for Diablo where they just assumed this would be the best experience for most users. Is if you're on an Intel card, they'd want you using this, where it actually runs fully. When you use the Intel's upscaler on a non-Intel card, it runs a different code path, and it's much worse. It's actually kind of terrible. But on an Intel card, it's actually really nice. So like I don't doubt that they think that this is the best case. Many people would rather have the option. You can actually force enable these in the INI tweaks as well, I believe, but you probably wouldn't want to bother with it. But if this was just the case where these games are not adding DLSS because of NVIDIA, and they'll tell you things like this, like Unreal Engine just has a click checkbox to add it in. So this game right here, Unreal Engine, but there's no DLSS, and it's not AMD sponsored. But what about this Aliens Dark? Oh wait, it's Unreal Engine again. So if this is really just the case of there's no excuse to not add DLSS, except for if AMD's paying you, wouldn't you expect that these non-partnered games would also be doing this, but or would be adding DLSS? Why is that? It's almost as if adding DLSS and FSR are not just simple, just click a checkbox. There's a big thing that when you use the plugin in Unreal Engine, you can technically enable it with almost no time, but then you have to configure it to make it run properly. And you have to test to make sure it gives people a good experience. And that's a lot of development time that a lot of devs don't think is worth the time they want to put into it. Like Vampire the Masquerade, this is an Unreal Engine game as well. Many of these games that do not have DLSS are Unreal Engine games, regardless of if they're AMD sponsored or not. This is not just an AMD blocking them